The great hall of Blackthorn Ridge had never been so silent. Hundreds of pack members stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the iron chandeliers, their breath held, their eyes fixed on the raised platform where Alpha King Damien Voss stood alone. He was supposed to say one name, just one. The entire future of the kingdom rested on those two words, and every soul in that hall believed they already knew what those words would be. Damien had not slept in 3 days. His father's body had been laid to rest only a week earlier, and the crown had passed to him before he was ready to carry it. The elders had pushed the selection forward, insisting that a kingdom without a Luna beside its king was a kingdom exposed to enemies on every border. Damien had agreed, exhausted, grieving, and desperate to silence the council's endless warnings. He had rehearsed the name 100 times in his mind. Seraphine Cole, the daughter of Alpha Cassian Cole, ruler of the neighboring Redfern pack. Their families had been in quiet talks for months, an alliance built on old bloodlines and careful diplomacy, and Damien had every intention of calling her forward tonight. It was the sensible choice, the expected choice. But when he opened his mouth, something inside him hesitated. A flicker of doubt passed through his chest so fast he barely registered it, and by the time his voice broke the silence, the wrong name had already left his lips. Elena Marsh. For a moment, nobody moved. The name hung in the air like smoke, unfamiliar and strange, and Damien felt his own stomach drop, as if his body understood the mistake before his mind did. He had not meant to say it. He barely knew who it belonged to. Somewhere in the vast crowd, a young woman in a plain gray dress went rigid, her wooden tray of half-cleared glasses trembling in her hands. Elena Marsh had not come to the selection to be chosen. She had come because every servant in the palace was required to attend, standing along the back wall, where the nobles would not have to look at her. She worked in the kitchens, scrubbing pots long after the feast had ended, and the important people had gone to bed. She was nobody. She had built her entire life around being nobody, because being seen had never brought her anything but trouble. When the king's voice called her name across the hall, she thought at first that she had misheard. She looked to her left and right, certain another Elena stood somewhere nearby, someone with a title, someone with the right kind of blood. But the crowd was already turning to face her. Hundreds of eyes, sharp and curious and hungry for a story, all landing on the girl with the tray of glasses. "That is not possible," someone near the front muttered, loud enough for half the hall to hear. Elena felt her face burn. Her hands did not stop shaking until the tray slipped from her fingers and shattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the silence like a verdict. On the platform, Damien stared down at her, his jaw tight, his mind racing through every possible way to undo what had just happened. He opened his mouth to correct himself, to explain that he had misspoken, that the true name was Seraphine, but the words never came. Beside him, old Councilman Ferris stepped forward, his weathered face pale with alarm. "My king," Ferris said quietly, though his voice carried further than he intended. "You know the law. Once a name is spoken beneath the ancestor's moon, it cannot be unspoken. The bond has been declared." Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides. "It was an error," he said, low enough that only the council could hear. "I meant to call Seraphine Cole. You all know this. Everyone in this hall knows this." "The law does not care what you meant," Ferris answered. "It cares what was said." Across the hall, Alpha Cassian Cole rose from his seat, with a face like a closing door. Beside him, Seraphine sat frozen, her expression cracking between disbelief and fury, as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. She had spent months preparing for this night, learning the customs of Blackthorn Ridge, practicing the words she would say when her name was called. She had never once imagined that the king's mouth would betray her in front of everyone she knew. Elena stood alone at the back of the hall, broken glass scattered around her feet, feeling the weight of every stare pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to slip through the crowd and disappear into the kitchens, back into the safety of being unnoticed. But 2 guards in the king's colors were already moving toward her, their expressions unreadable, and she understood with a sick twist in her stomach that running was no longer an option. "Elena Marsh," one of the guards said, his voice gentler than she expected. "The king has called your name. You are required to come forward." She looked past him, toward the platform, toward the man who had just turned her entire life upside down with 2 careless words. Damien was watching her now, his gaze sharp and unreadable, and for a moment, she thought she saw something close to panic behind his eyes. It did not make her feel any better. If the most powerful man in the kingdom was afraid of what had just happened, what chance did she have? Her legs carried her forward before her mind fully agreed to it. The crowd parted in front of her, murmurs rippling outward, like water disturbed by a stone. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the worn stone floor, counting her steps to keep herself from shaking apart entirely. When she finally reached the platform, she forced herself to look up at the king, and the two of them stood facing each other, while an entire kingdom watched to see what would happen next. "This is a mistake," Damien said, quiet enough that his voice would not carry past the front rows, though Elena suspected everyone strained to hear it anyway. "I need you to understand that. This was never meant to happen." Elena's throat tightened, humiliation and anger rising in equal measure. "You think I don't know that," she whispered back. "I have never spoken to you in my life. I don't know why my name left your mouth, but I promise you, I want this even less than you do." Something flickered across Damien's face, surprise perhaps, or maybe the first hint of respect, though he did not have time to examine it. Councilman Ferris cleared his throat behind them, drawing both their attention back to the gathered crowd, who were beginning to whisper louder, restless with confusion and suspicion. "The law is clear," Ferris announced to the hall, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had presided over difficult moments before. "A name spoken during the selection under the ancestor's moon binds the speaker to the one named. There is no ceremony to reverse it. There is no loophole written into our oldest laws that allows a king to unspeak a chosen name." A ripple of protest rose from the Cole family's section of the hall. Cassian Cole stood taller, his voice booming across the space with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "My daughter has spent 5 months preparing for this alliance. Her family has spent generations building a relationship with this pack. You cannot allow one slip of the tongue to undo all of that." "With respect, Alpha Cole," Ferris said carefully, "the law does not concern itself with preparation or expectation. It concerns itself with words spoken beneath the sacred moon, and tonight, those words named Elena Marsh." Seraphine rose from her seat then, her composure cracking at last. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. "She is a servant. She scrubs pots in the kitchen. She has no training, no lineage worth mentioning, nothing that qualifies her to stand beside a king. This cannot be allowed to stand." Elena felt each word land like a slap, though she kept her face carefully blank, refusing to give Seraphine the satisfaction of a visible reaction. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing unaffected, and she called on every ounce of that practice now, standing straight beside a king who clearly wished she were anyone else. Damien's jaw tightened at Seraphine's outburst, though whether from embarrassment or something closer to defensiveness, Elena could not tell. "That is enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command for the first time that evening. "Whatever mistake occurred tonight, it was mine, not Elena's. I will not have her insulted for an error that was not hers to make." The hall fell quiet again, though the tension had not eased in the slightest. Elena glanced sideways at him, startled by the unexpected defense, though she reminded herself quickly that it likely had more to do with his own pride than any real concern for her. A king did not want to be seen tolerating insults thrown at someone bound to him, even by accident. Ferris stepped forward once more, addressing the full hall with the gravity the moment demanded. "The law requires that the bound pair undergo a period of joining, no less than 1 full turning of the moon, during which the selection may not be contested or reversed. At the end of that period, the Elder Council will determine whether the bond holds true or whether release may be granted under exceptional circumstances." "A month," Damien repeated, almost to himself, as though saying the number aloud might make it feel less impossible. "A month," Ferris confirmed, "during which Elena Marsh will reside within the palace, under the protection and observation of the crown, as is customary for any chosen mate." Elena's stomach dropped further, if that were even possible. Living in the palace, under observation, bound to a king who had already made it clear, both in his panicked eyes and his hurried words, that he wanted nothing to do with her. She thought of her small room above the kitchens, the only space in the world that had ever truly belonged to her, and felt a fresh wave of grief settle over the humiliation already sitting heavy in her chest. "I have a life," she said quietly, though loud enough for those nearest the platform to hear. I have work. I have people who depend on me. Your duties will be reassigned, Ferris said, not unkindly, though the words still landed like another loss. For the next month, your only duty is to the crown. Seraphine did not sit back down. She stood glaring at Elena, with an intensity that promised this was far from over, and Elena understood in that moment that surviving the coming month would require more than patience. It would require her to watch her back, because the woman across the hall had lost something she believed was rightfully hers, and people who lost things they believed they deserved rarely let go quietly. Cassian Cole placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, murmuring something too quiet for Elena to catch, though his expression remained hard as stone as he studied the platform. Elena had the distinct impression that whatever alliance her presence had disrupted, the Cole family would not simply walk away and accept defeat. Kingdoms had fractured over smaller insults than this one. The council dismissed the hall soon after, though the murmuring did not stop, only shifted from public whispers to private ones as pack members filed out into the night, already reshaping the evening's events into a story they would tell for years to come. The girl from the kitchens, chosen by mistake, standing beside the king who could not take back his own words. Damien turned to Elena once the hall had mostly emptied, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the remaining torches. I am sorry, he said, and for a moment his voice lost some of its royal formality, sounding instead like an exhausted young man who had simply made an error at the worst possible time. Whatever happens over the next month, I will make certain you are treated with respect. This is not your fault. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the arrogance she expected from a king, the dismissiveness she had braced herself for since her name first left his lips. She found something else instead, something closer to genuine regret, though she was too raw from the evening's events to trust it completely. Respect would be nice, she said finally, allowing a trace of her real feelings to slip through her careful composure. But what I really want is my old life back. Since that isn't an option, I suppose respect will have to do. A guard approached to escort her toward the palace's private wing, and Elena cast one last look back at the hall, at the shattered glass still scattered near the back wall where her tray had fallen, a small broken reminder of the ordinary evening she had expected before everything changed. She did not know yet what the coming month would bring, whether the bond would hold or break, whether she would survive the sharp edges of court politics or be crushed beneath them. What she did know, walking down the long corridor toward a life she had never asked for, was that nothing about her existence would ever be simple again. The king had spoken the wrong name beneath the ancestors' moon, and now, whether either of them wanted it or not, their fates were tied together until the next full moon rose, and the council decided what to do with the mistake that had reshaped an entire kingdom in a single breath. Behind her, in the emptying hall, Seraphine Cole remained standing long after everyone else had gone, her eyes fixed on the space where Elena had stood, already turning over the beginnings of a plan in her mind. She had not spent months building toward this crown, only to lose it to a servant girl because of a slip of the king's tongue. Whatever it took, she intended to see her rightful place restored, and she did not particularly care what happened to the girl who stood in her way. The guard led Elena through corridors she had only ever seen from behind a serving tray, past paintings of long-dead kings and queens, whose eyes seemed to follow her with quiet judgment. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold in the tremor that had settled into her bones since the moment her name left the king's mouth. Every step deeper into the palace felt like a step further from the only life she understood. They stopped outside a set of tall doors carved with the crest of Blackthorn Ridge, a wolf standing beneath a crescent moon. The guard pushed them open to reveal a chamber larger than the entire cottage Elena had grown up in, with a wide bed dressed in pale blue linen, a fireplace already lit against the evening chill, and windows overlooking the dark forest beyond the palace walls. This will be your room for the month, the guard said. Someone will bring your belongings from the servants' quarters in the morning. If you need anything tonight, there is a bell by the door. Elena thanked him quietly and waited until the door clicked shut before she allowed herself to sink onto the edge of the bed, the events of the evening finally catching up to her all at once. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of a night that had turned her entire world inside out in the space of a single sentence. She thought of her mother, gone now for 3 years, who had always told her that being invisible was the safest way to survive, in a world that did not welcome people like them. Elena had built her whole life around that advice, keeping her head down, working hard, never drawing attention to herself. And now, through no choice of her own, she was the most talked about woman in the kingdom, bound to a king who barely knew her name before tonight. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, pulled back in a neat braid, carrying a tray of tea and bread. "I thought you might not have eaten," the woman said gently. "I am old Marta. I have worked in this palace longer than anyone cares to admit." "I heard what happened tonight." Elena managed a tired smile and stepped aside to let her in. "Everyone has heard what happened tonight, I imagine. By morning, the whole kingdom will know," Marta agreed, setting the tray down on a small table near the fire. "But do not let that frighten you more than it already has. Strange things happen under the ancestors' moon. Sometimes stranger things than a mistaken name." "You think this was more than a mistake?" Elena asked, surprised by the suggestion. Marta considered the question carefully before answering. "I think the old magic does not make mistakes as easily as young kings like to believe. But that is not my place to say, and you have had a long enough night without an old woman filling your head with more mysteries." She patted Elena's shoulder with surprising warmth. "Eat something. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles, and you will need your strength to meet them." After Marta left, Elena picked at the bread without much appetite, her mind circling back again and again, to the moment the king's voice had called her name, to the shock on his face that mirrored her own. She did not believe in fate the way some in the pack did not trust in old magic or ancient bonds, but something about the way Damien had hesitated before speaking, the flicker of doubt she thought she saw across his face, stayed with her long after the tea had gone cold. Across the palace, in his own chambers, Damien stood at his window staring out at the same dark forest, unable to shake the strange, unsettled feeling that had followed him since the selection ended. He had gone over the moment countless times already, trying to understand how Seraphine's name had transformed into Elena's, somewhere between his mind and his mouth. He had never spoken to the girl before tonight. He barely recognized her face among the palace staff, and yet something in him had chosen her, whether by mistake or by some force he did not understand. And now an entire month stretched ahead of them both, filled with uncertainty neither had asked for. He thought of Seraphine's fury, of Cassian Cole's barely contained anger, of the alliance he had spent months carefully building now hanging by a thread because of 2 careless words. The council would expect him to manage the fallout, to keep the peace between packs, to somehow salvage a political relationship that tonight's events had badly damaged. And beneath all of that, quietly, uncomfortably, he found himself thinking of the way Elena had stood her ground on the platform, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares, meeting his eyes with a directness that few people in his life ever dared to show him. It meant nothing, he told himself. A month from now, the council would surely find a way to release them both from a bond built on error rather than truth, and life would return to its intended course. Seraphine would forgive the mistake, the alliance would hold, and Elena Marsh would return to whatever quiet life she had been living, before his careless tongue disrupted it. He almost believed himself. Outside his window, the ancestors' moon still hung high and full above the tree line, pale and watchful, indifferent to the chaos it had set in motion within the walls below. Somewhere in the forest beyond, a wolf howled once, long and low, and Damien felt an unfamiliar chill move through him that had nothing to do with the night air. Whatever the coming month held, he understood, standing alone in his darkened chamber, that tonight had changed something in Blackthorn Ridge that could not be easily undone, no matter what the council eventually decided. The name had been spoken. The bond had been declared, and somewhere down the hall, in a chamber far grander than she was used to, a servant girl who had spent her whole life avoiding notice now found herself impossible to ignore. Neither of them slept well that night. Neither of them yet understood how much more difficult the days ahead would prove to be, or how many people within the palace walls were already scheming, plotting, and preparing to make certain that Elena Marsh did not survive her month as the accidental, almost Luna of Blackthorn Ridge. Morning came too fast for Elena, sunlight spilling through unfamiliar curtains and pulling her from a shallow, restless sleep. For a few confused seconds she forgot where she was, reaching out of habit for the low wooden beam above her old cot in the servants' quarters. Her hand found only empty air and soft linen, and the memory of the previous night crashed back over her all at once. She sat up slowly, taking in the room again in daylight, the tall windows, the carved furniture, the fireplace now burned down to quiet embers. None of it felt real. She half expected someone to knock on the door and tell her the whole thing had been a strange dream, that she was late for her shift in the kitchens, that the world had returned to its proper order overnight. Instead, there was a knock, and a young maid entered carrying a folded pile of clothing far finer than anything Elena had ever owned. "The council sent these for you," the maid said, avoiding Elena's eyes as she set the garments on the bed. "You are expected to meet with them within the hour." Elena dressed quickly, feeling strange and stiff in fabric so much softer than her usual work clothes. When she finally made her way through the palace corridors, following a guard's directions toward the council chambers, she felt every curious glance from passing staff and nobles alike, whispers trailing behind her like smoke. The council chamber was smaller than the great hall, but no less intimidating, with a long table where the elders sat waiting. Ferris among them, along with several others whose names Elena did not know. Damien stood near the window, arms crossed, looking as though he had slept even less than she had. "Elena Marsh," Ferris greeted her, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." She sat carefully, aware of every eye in the room studying her, weighing her, deciding in real time whether she belonged among them. "I assume this is where you tell me how quickly this mistake can be corrected," she said, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. A few of the elders exchanged glances at her directness, though Ferris only offered a small, tired smile. "We have spent the morning searching our oldest records for exactly that answer," he admitted. "I wish I could tell you we found an easy solution." "And?" Damien asked from the window, his voice tight with impatience. "The law is old, and it is strict," Ferris said. "A name spoken beneath the ancestors' moon, during a true selection, cannot be reversed by simple decree. The bond may only be broken through the joining period itself, should both parties prove, before the full council, that no true connection exists between them. Until that month passes, Elena Marsh is considered your intended mate in all formal matters." Damien's jaw tightened. "So we are simply meant to wait." "You are meant to live as though the bond might hold true," Ferris corrected gently. "The council must witness whether fate intervened last night, or whether this truly was nothing more than an unfortunate slip of the tongue. There is no shortcut through that process, my king, however much you might wish for one." Elena kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the men around her discuss her future, as though she were a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person sitting in the room. She thought of a dozen sharp things she might say, but held her tongue, reminding herself that surviving this month meant choosing her battles carefully. "What exactly does living as though the bond might hold true involve?" she asked instead, addressing Ferris directly. "You will remain within the palace," Ferris explained. "You will accompany the king to necessary functions, learn something of court customs, and allow the pact to observe you both together. It is not so different from a formal courtship, though considerably more public than either of you likely wished for." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of it, though the sound that left her was closer to disbelief than humor. A month of pretending to court a king who clearly did not want her, in front of a kingdom already primed to judge her unworthy. She glanced toward Damien, who was watching her now with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between reluctant curiosity and lingering frustration. "I have conditions," she said, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. Several elders raised their eyebrows, clearly unused to servants making demands in their chamber, but Ferris only nodded for her to continue. "I want my old room in the servants' quarters left untouched, in case this ends the way everyone expects it to," Elena said. "I want to be allowed to visit the kitchens, because the people there are the closest thing I have to family, and I refuse to be cut off from them for an entire month. And I want the truth told plainly to anyone who asks, that this bond began as a mistake, so that no one believes I schemed my way into this position." A murmur passed through the elders, though Ferris studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Reasonable requests," he said. "I see no reason to deny them." Damien finally stepped away from the window, moving closer to the table. "And what of my conditions?" he asked, his tone edged with something that might have been challenge. Elena turned to face him fully for the first time that morning. "You are the king. I imagine you can set whatever conditions you like without needing my permission first." "I would prefer this month pass with as little disruption as possible," he said. "No scenes in front of the council, no public disagreements that give Seraphine's family further reason to question the crown's stability. Whatever frustrations we have with each other, I would ask that we keep them private." "That seems fair," Elena said, "provided you extend me the same respect you are asking for. I have spent my whole life being spoken over by people who assumed my opinions did not matter. I will not spend this month the same way, mistake or not." Something shifted in Damien's expression, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by his usual composed exterior. "Understood," he said simply, and Elena thought she caught the faintest trace of respect beneath the word, though she refused to let herself dwell on it. The council dismissed them shortly after, leaving Elena and Damien to walk the corridor together in uncomfortable silence, a guard trailing several paces behind. Neither seemed to know what to say to the other, now that the formal negotiations had ended, and only the strange reality of their situation remained. "I did not expect you to speak up like that," Damien admitted eventually, breaking the silence as they passed beneath a row of tall arched windows. "Did you expect me to simply agree to whatever the council decided for me?" Elena asked. "I may be a servant, but I am not without opinions of my own." "That much is clear," he said, and though his voice remained even, Elena thought she detected something close to amusement beneath the words. "Most people in this palace do not speak to me the way you just did. Most people in this palace are afraid of you," Elena said plainly. "I suppose I should be too, given everything that has happened, but I find I am too tired and too irritated to manage proper fear at the moment." Despite himself, the corner of Damien's mouth twitched upward, the first genuine reaction she had seen from him since the previous night's disaster. "I will try not to take that as an insult." "Take it however you like," Elena said. "I have found that honesty tends to save time, even when it is inconvenient." They reached a junction in the corridor where their paths diverged, Damien toward the council's private meeting rooms, Elena toward the wing where her new chamber waited. He paused before leaving, studying her with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. "For what it is worth," he said, "I am sorry this has disrupted your life so completely. Whatever happens at the end of this month, I intend to make certain you are not left worse off for a mistake that was entirely mine to make." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, searching for insincerity and finding none. "Thank you," she said finally, "though I would settle for simply surviving the next month without anyone deciding I do not belong here badly enough to make certain of it." She did not know, as she turned and walked away, how close her words would come to the truth in the days ahead, or how many quiet enemies she had already made within these walls, simply by answering to a name that was never meant to be hers. Later that afternoon, word reached her that Seraphine Cole had requested a private audience with the council, and Elena felt the fragile calm of the morning begin to crack beneath a fresh wave of unease. Whatever the beautiful, furious daughter of Alpha Cole intended to say behind those closed doors, Elena doubted it would work in her favor. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Elena woke each morning in her grand chamber, ate breakfast alone unless Marta found an excuse to visit, and spent her afternoons shadowing Damien through a schedule of meetings, inspections and formal greetings that left her feet aching and her patience worn thin. The pack watched her everywhere she went, some with open curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain, and she quickly learned to read the difference between a genuine smile and one offered only for the sake of appearances. Seraphine's audience with the council had not gone the way Elena feared, at least not immediately. The elders had listened politely to her arguments about tradition and preparation and the sanctity of long-planned alliances, and then had explained, as gently as such things could be explained to a furious young woman, that the law offered no path to simply swap one bound name for another. Seraphine had left the chamber in a controlled fury that everyone in the palace seemed to sense without needing to be told, and in the days since, the whispers about Elena's unworthiness had only grown louder. It started small, a comment overheard in the corridor about servants who forgot their place. A cold shoulder from a noblewoman Elena had once served tea to without complaint. Then it grew bolder, whispered accusations that Elena had somehow influenced the king, perhaps through some forbidden charm or trick, because surely a servant girl could not simply be chosen by honest accident. "They are saying I bewitched you," Elena told Damien one evening, as they walked together toward a dinner neither of them particularly wanted to attend. "Apparently, kitchen staff have secret knowledge of enchantments now. I wish someone had told me sooner. It would have made scrubbing pots far less tedious." Damien glanced at her, caught somewhere between exasperation and reluctant amusement, an expression that was becoming familiar between them. "You find this funny." "I find it easier to laugh than to cry," Elena said honestly, "though I admit the laughing grows harder each day." He slowed his pace slightly, studying her more closely than he had allowed himself to before. "Has someone said something to you directly? Threatened you in any way?" "Nothing so bold," Elena said. "Mostly just the usual unkindness people reserve for those they have decided do not belong. I have dealt with worse. I will survive a few weeks of cold looks and cruel whispers." "You should not have to," Damien said, an edge of genuine frustration entering his voice. "This was my mistake. You are the one paying for it." "We are both paying for it," Elena corrected. "You simply pay in different currency, reputation and alliances, instead of scrubbed floors and cold stares." Despite the tension between them, Elena found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed once they stopped performing formality for each other. Damien, freed from the weight of council meetings and political posturing, revealed flashes of dry humor and quiet thoughtfulness she had not expected from a king, raised to command armies and negotiate treaties. She still did not trust him completely, still carried the memory of his obvious dismay when her name was first called, but the sharp edges of their early exchanges had begun to soften into something more like uneasy partnership. That partnership was tested severely the following week, when Elena returned to her chamber to find her belongings disturbed, drawers left slightly open, her few personal items shifted from where she had left them. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the message felt clear enough. Someone within the palace wanted her to know she was being watched, that her privacy meant little to those determined to see her fail. She debated telling Damien at all, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her frightened, but Marta noticed her unusual quietness at dinner and gently pressed, until Elena admitted what had happened. "You must tell the king," Marta insisted. "This is not something to keep to yourself, child. Whoever did this wanted you frightened. Do not let them succeed by staying silent." Reluctantly, Elena mentioned it to Damien the next morning, keeping her tone deliberately light, as though the intrusion mattered little. He did not take the news as calmly as she had hoped. "Someone entered your private chamber," he said, his voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous than she had heard from him before. "This is not a matter of cruel gossip anymore. This is a direct threat." "It might have been nothing," Elena said, though even she did not fully believe it. Perhaps a maid simply moved things while cleaning. "Maids do not open drawers and leave them ajar as a warning," Damien said. "I will assign a guard to your chamber." "I do not need a guard following me everywhere," Elena protested. "I have managed to survive without one for 23 years. You have not survived a month bound to a king, with enemies eager to see the bond fail," Damien countered, his frustration evident. "This is not about doubting your ability to manage yourself. It is about making certain no one within these walls decides to help the council reach its decision through less honest means." Elena wanted to argue further, but the genuine concern beneath his sharpness gave her pause. She thought of the whispers following her through the corridors, the cold stares from Seraphine's allies among the nobility, the quiet certainty that someone in this palace wished her gone badly enough to enter her private chamber uninvited. Perhaps stubborn pride was not worth the risk. "Fine," she said eventually. "A guard, but I choose who it is." Damien raised an eyebrow, though he did not argue the point. "Do you have someone in mind?" "Corin," Elena said, naming a young guard she had known since childhood, the son of another kitchen worker, who had grown up alongside her in the servants' quarters. "I trust him. That matters more to me right now than rank or reputation." "Then Corin it is," Damien agreed, and Elena felt a small measure of relief at having at least this one decision remain entirely her own. The days continued to pass beneath the growing shadow of suspicion and whispered accusations, though Elena found small comforts where she could. Marta's visits became a welcome ritual, filled with old stories about the palace and gentle wisdom about surviving court politics without losing oneself entirely. Corin's quiet, steady presence outside her door each night offered a measure of safety she had not realized she needed until it arrived. And despite everything, her strange, uneasy conversations with Damien continued to shift into something less guarded, though neither of them dared name what exactly was growing between them. One evening, walking together through the palace gardens after another long and tedious formal dinner, Elena finally asked the question that had been sitting uncomfortably in her mind since the night of the selection. "Do you think it truly was an accident?" she asked, watching moonlight scatter across the surface of a quiet fountain. "Or do you think something else made you say my name instead of hers?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question with more seriousness than Elena expected. "I have asked myself that same thing every night since it happened," he admitted finally. "I do not have an answer I trust yet. Part of me believes it was simple exhaustion, grief, the pressure of that night finally catching up to my tongue at the worst possible moment. But another part of me wonders if something older than my own intentions decided that night belonged to someone other than who I had planned." "That sounds like something Marta would say," Elena said softly. "Marta has been telling me the same thing for years," Damien admitted, a faint smile crossing his tired face. "I have simply never had reason to believe her before now." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the tension of the past weeks momentarily easing beneath the quiet beauty of the garden, and the strange, fragile understanding growing between them. Neither spoke of what such an admission might mean for the month ahead, or for the alliance still hanging precariously between Blackthorn Ridge and the Cole family, or for Seraphine's growing fury simmering somewhere within the palace walls. But somewhere in the shadows beyond the garden path, unseen eyes watched the two of them together, noting with cold calculation how much closer the accidental bond seemed to be growing with each passing day, and beginning to understand that stronger measures would be needed if Seraphine Cole intended to reclaim what she believed had been unfairly stolen from her. The next morning brought fresh trouble, delivered in the form of a folded letter left outside Elena's door before dawn, containing a single cruel accusation about her mother's past that Elena had hoped had been buried and forgotten years ago. Someone within the palace was digging into her family history, and whatever they intended to unearth, Elena understood with growing dread that it would not be used kindly. Elena stared at the letter for a long time before she found the courage to unfold it fully. The handwriting was neat, careful, deliberately anonymous, and the words inside struck deeper than any cruel whisper she had endured so far. It spoke of her mother in terms that made Elena's chest tighten with old grief and older shame, hinting at a past Elena herself barely understood, questions about where her mother had truly come from before she settled in Blackthorn Ridge, suggestions that the blood running through Elena's veins carried a taint the pack would never accept. She had heard fragments of this story before, whispered by cruel children when she was young, hinted at by adults who thought she could not hear them. Her mother had never spoken openly about her life before Blackthorn Ridge, only offering vague mentions of a difficult childhood and a family she had left behind for reasons she refused to discuss. Elena had learned early not to ask, sensing the pain such questions caused, and had spent her whole life carrying an unfinished story she never had the chance to complete before her mother passed. Now someone within the palace seemed determined to drag that unfinished story into the light, twisting whatever fragments they had gathered into something ugly enough to use against her. Elena folded the letter carefully and tucked it away, unwilling to let anyone see how deeply it had shaken her, though the tremor in her hands as she dressed for the day betrayed her regardless. She said nothing to Damien at first, uncertain how to explain a wound she barely understood herself, uncertain whether admitting weakness to a king who already carried enough political burden would help, or simply add to his troubles. But Marta noticed the shadows beneath her eyes at breakfast, and gentle questioning eventually drew the truth out of her. "Someone has been asking questions about your mother," Marta said slowly, once Elena finished explaining. Her expression had grown troubled, though not entirely surprised. "I wondered if this might happen eventually." "You know something," Elena said, studying the old woman's face carefully. "About my mother's past." Marta hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "I know that your mother arrived in Blackthorn Ridge many years ago, alone, carrying almost nothing, and asking for nothing more than quiet work and a place to raise a child in peace. I know that old Alpha Voss, your king's father, granted her that peace without asking many questions, which was unusual for him. Beyond that, child, I know very little for certain. Only rumors too old and too uncertain to repeat responsibly. Rumors about what? Elena pressed. About bloodlines, Marta admitted reluctantly. About packs that existed long before Blackthorn Ridge, some of them lost to war or disease generations ago. Their surviving members scattered and hidden, their old gifts and old dangers forgotten by most. I do not know if your mother belonged to such a pack, or if the rumors were simply cruel gossip aimed at a woman who kept to herself. But I do know that whoever is sending you letters seems determined to make you doubt where you truly belong, and that alone should tell you something about their intentions. Elena carried Marta's words with her through the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind during a tense council meeting about border patrols, during a stiff formal luncheon with visiting dignitaries, during the quiet hours afterward when she finally found herself alone with Damien in the palace library, ostensibly reviewing customs documents she was expected to learn but barely reading a single word. "You are distracted today," Damien observed eventually, setting down the scroll he had been studying to look at her directly. Elena hesitated only a moment before pulling the folded letter from where she had kept it hidden and handing it to him without explanation. She watched his expression darken as he read it, his jaw tightening with the same controlled anger she had seen when he learned about her disturbed chamber. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I do not know," Elena admitted. "It was left outside my door before dawn, unsigned." "This is beyond cruel gossip," Damien said, setting the letter down carefully, as though handling something dangerous. "Someone is deliberately trying to unearth information about your family, likely intending to use whatever they find against you before the council. I want to know who is behind this." "Even if we discover who sent it," Elena said, "what would that change? The questions it raises are still questions I cannot answer. I do not know where my mother came from before Blackthorn Ridge. I do not know why she never spoke of her past. If there truly is something in my bloodline that makes me unworthy in the eyes of this pack, exposing the letter's author will not erase that truth. Nothing about your worth depends on bloodlines or old rumors," Damien said firmly. "You have proven more resilience in these past weeks than most nobles I have known my entire life. Whatever your mother's history, it does not define who you are." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the practiced diplomacy she expected from a king skilled at saying the right words to smooth over difficult moments. She found instead something that felt genuine, a conviction in his voice that surprised her with its steadiness. "You truly believe that," she said, not quite a question. "I do," Damien said simply, "and I intend to find whoever sent that letter, because someone within these walls believes threatening you is an acceptable way to protect their own interests, and I will not allow that to continue unanswered." True to his word, Damien spent the following days quietly investigating the letter's origins, though the trail proved frustratingly difficult to follow. The handwriting matched no one obviously connected to the palace staff. The parchment was common enough to have come from any merchant in the kingdom. Whoever had written it had been careful, deliberate, clearly experienced in the art of causing damage while avoiding blame. Elena, meanwhile, found herself growing more determined rather than more afraid. She had spent her entire life shrinking herself to avoid drawing attention, hiding behind quiet obedience and careful invisibility, because she believed it kept her safe. But safety built on invisibility had never truly protected her mother from whatever pain haunted her past, and it would not protect Elena now that her name had already been spoken beneath the ancestor's moon for the entire kingdom to hear. If someone within these walls wanted her gone badly enough to threaten her privacy and dig through her family's painful history, Elena decided she would meet that threat with more resolve, not less. She began spending time in the palace archives during quiet hours, searching through old pack records for any mention of lost bloodlines or scattered families that might connect to whatever fragments Marta had shared with her. She found little of substance in those early searches, mostly incomplete records and faded ink, too damaged to read clearly, but the effort itself steadied her, gave her something productive to focus on, beyond simply waiting anxiously for the next cruel surprise to arrive at her door. Corin remained a quiet, steady presence throughout, walking her to and from the archives without complaint. never pressing her for details about what she searched for, but always ready with a reassuring word when her frustration grew visible. His loyalty, unwavering since childhood, became one of the few constants Elena could rely on completely during a month that had otherwise upended everything she thought she understood about her place in the world. Meanwhile, across the palace, Seraphine Cole continued her own quiet campaign, though she had grown more careful since the council dismissed her initial protests. She cultivated sympathy among the visiting nobility, painted herself as the wronged party in every conversation, and waited patiently for an opportunity that would prove far more effective than anonymous letters and disturbed chambers. She did not yet know what that opportunity would look like, but she trusted her own patience, and she trusted that a servant girl thrust suddenly into palace life would eventually make a mistake significant enough to justify removing her permanently from the king's side. She did not have to wait much longer. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon that began like any other and ended with Elena discovering a part of herself she never knew existed. A group of young pack children had gathered near the training grounds to watch the palace guards practice, drawn by the excitement of clashing wooden swords and shouted instructions. Elena had been crossing the courtyard on her way to the archives when she heard the first scream. One of the younger children, a small boy no older than 6, had wandered too close to the sparring ring, just as 2 guards executed a particularly forceful exchange. A wild swing sent one guard stumbling backward, directly toward the spot where the boy stood frozen with fear, too startled to move out of the way in time. Elena did not think, she simply moved, crossing the distance between them faster than she believed herself capable of, pulling the boy backward and taking the brunt of the guard's stumbling weight against her own shoulder instead. Pain flared bright and sharp through her arm as she hit the ground, but the boy was safe, crying but unharmed, clutched tightly against her chest. The training ground fell into chaos for a moment, guards rushing forward, the boy's mother appearing, seemingly out of nowhere to gather her son into her arms with tearful gratitude. Elena tried to wave off the fuss, insisting she was fine despite the throbbing pain in her shoulder, but word of the incident spread through the palace faster than she could manage the damage to her own composure. Damien arrived within minutes, his expression tight with concern, as he knelt beside her, examining the darkening bruise, already spreading across her shoulder. "You could have been seriously hurt," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I am fine," Elena insisted, though she winced as he gently helped her to her feet. "The boy is what matters. He is unharmed." "Because you put yourself between him and a fully grown guard without a second thought," Damien said, something in his tone shifting from concern into something closer to awe. "Most people would have hesitated. You did not hesitate at all." Elena shrugged, immediately regretting the motion as pain shot through her injured shoulder. He was a child in danger. There was nothing to think about. Damien insisted on personally escorting her to the palace healer, despite her protests that the injury was minor, and Elena found herself unexpectedly touched by his insistence on staying while the healer examined and treated her bruised shoulder, asking careful questions, watching her reactions with an attentiveness that felt different from simple political obligation. "You did not have to stay," she told him afterward, as they walked slowly back toward her chamber, her arm now wrapped in a supportive bandage. "I wanted to," Damien said simply, and something about the plainness of his answer settled warmly in Elena's chest, despite the ache still radiating from her shoulder. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the courtyard behind them, slowly returning to its usual rhythm, before Damien spoke again, his voice quieter and more thoughtful than she had heard from him before. "I have been thinking about what you asked me in the garden, about whether that night was truly an accident." Elena glanced at him, curious despite herself. "And? I still do not have a certain answer," he admitted, "but I find myself less troubled by the uncertainty than I once was. Watching you today, the way you moved without hesitation to protect someone who needed help, I found myself thinking that perhaps whatever chose your name that night understood something about you that I did not yet know." Elena's cheeks warmed, and she was grateful for the distraction of adjusting her bandage to avoid meeting his eyes directly. "That sounds dangerously close to a compliment, my king." "Perhaps it is," Damien said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I find I am running out of reasons to resist giving them." They reached her chamber door, and for a moment, neither of them moved to end the conversation. the space between them charged with something neither had fully named yet. Elena thought of the weeks that had passed since the disastrous selection, of the cruel letters and disturbed drawers and whispered accusations that had followed her since, and found herself surprised by how much steadier she felt standing here now, beside a man she had initially resented for upending her entire life. "Thank you," she said finally, "for staying with me today, for believing me about the letter, for treating me like someone whose opinions matter, even when half the palace seems determined to convince you otherwise. You make it easy to believe you," Damien said quietly. "I only wish I had recognized that sooner." Elena did not know quite how to respond to the warmth in his voice, so she simply offered a small, genuine smile before retreating into her chamber, closing the door softly behind her and leaning against it for a long moment, her heart beating faster than the day's injury alone could explain. In the days that followed, small moments like these accumulated between them, quiet and unremarkable on their own, but forming a pattern neither could ignore. A shared joke during a tedious council briefing that left them both struggling to keep straight faces. A late evening conversation in the library that stretched hours longer than either intended. A moment in the garden when Damien reached out to steady her on an uneven path, his hand lingering against hers a beat longer than necessary before either of them acknowledged it. Elena told herself repeatedly that these moments meant nothing, that the council would soon determine the bond was nothing more than an unfortunate accident, that she would return to her old life in the kitchens, and this strange, unexpected month would fade into an unusual story she told for the rest of her years. But each night, lying awake in her grand chamber, she found it harder to convince herself that returning to her old life was something she truly wanted anymore. Damien struggled with similar doubts of his own, though he kept them more carefully hidden even from himself. He had spent weeks assuring the council, Seraphine's furious family, and even his own advisors, that the bond was a mistake soon to be corrected, and yet each day spent in Elena's company chipped away further at his certainty. He found himself watching for her smile during long formal dinners, listening for her sharp, honest observations during council meetings, missing her presence during the rare hours they spent apart. Neither spoke openly of what was growing between them, both too cautious, too aware of everything still unresolved around them, to name it plainly. But beneath the surface of careful formality and cautious friendship, something undeniable had begun to take root, growing stronger with each passing day of their strange, unwanted month together. It would not remain hidden for much longer. The visiting healer arrived on a gray afternoon, summoned from a distant pack to consult on an unrelated matter of pack health, and Elena had no reason to expect her arrival would upend anything at all. She met the woman, an elderly healer named Ophelia Grant, only briefly in the palace corridor, exchanging a polite greeting, before continuing on her way toward the archives where she had taken to spending her quiet afternoons. But Ophelia stopped mid-step, her expression shifting into something startled and intent as Elena passed. "Forgive me," the healer said, her voice carrying an odd note of urgency, "but might I ask your name, child?" Elena paused, surprised by the request. "Elena Marsh." "Marsh," Ophelia repeated slowly, studying Elena's face with an intensity that made her distinctly uncomfortable. "And your mother, if I may ask, what was her name before she married?" "I do not know," Elena admitted, the familiar ache of an unfinished family history rising uncomfortably in her chest. She never spoke of her life before Blackthorn Ridge. Ophelia's expression grew even more focused, and she requested, with careful politeness, a private audience to discuss what she believed she had recognized. Elena, curious despite her hesitation, agreed, and the two of them found a quiet corner of the library where Ophelia explained, in halting and careful words, what had caught her attention. "There is a particular pattern to your scent," Ophelia said, "and something in the shape of your features that I have not encountered in many years, not since I was a young healer myself, training under an old master, who once described a bloodline, believed lost to war and sickness generations ago. The Thornwood line, they were called, known for a rare gift tied to healing and protection, passed down through very specific bloodlines that grew increasingly scarce as their packs scattered and their numbers dwindled." Elena felt a strange chill move through her at the words, memories of Marta's earlier hints about lost packs and forgotten bloodlines resurfacing sharply in her mind. "You believe my mother belonged to this line?" "I believe it is possible," Ophelia said carefully. I cannot be certain without further study, but the resemblance struck me the moment I saw you, and such things are not easily mistaken by those trained to notice them. If I am correct, your bloodline is not merely acceptable among this pack, Elena Marsh. It is remarkable. Carrying gifts, many packs would consider a treasure rather than a burden. Elena sat with this information for a long moment, turning it over carefully, uncertain whether to believe something so far removed from the shameful whispers she had grown up hearing about her mother's mysterious past. If this is true, she said slowly, why would my mother hide it? Why let people believe there was something wrong with our blood rather than something extraordinary? Fear, perhaps, Ophelia suggested gently. Bloodlines with rare gifts often draw dangerous attention, from those who wish to use such gifts for their own purposes, or from those who fear what they do not understand. Your mother may have believed hiding her heritage was the safer path, especially raising a daughter alone in an unfamiliar pack. Elena thought of her mother's careful quietness, her reluctance to discuss the past, the protective instinct that had always seemed to guide her choices, even when Elena, as a child, had not understood the reasons behind them. Perhaps hiding had never been about shame at all, but about protection, a mother trying desperately to keep her daughter safe from dangers Elena had never known existed. She shared Ophelia's revelations with Damien that evening, watching his expression shift from careful attention to something like quiet astonishment as she explained what the healer believed she had recognized. The Thornwood line, he said slowly, as though testing the weight of the name. I have heard old stories about them, mostly treated as myths by this point, tales of healers whose gifts could mend wounds no ordinary medicine could touch. You believe it could be true? Elena asked. I believe Ophelia Grant is respected throughout the northern packs for her knowledge of bloodlines and old pack history, Damien said. If she recognized something in you significant enough to interrupt her own errand to ask about it, I am inclined to take her observation seriously. He studied Elena carefully, something warm and thoughtful entering his expression. This changes a great deal, if it proves accurate. The whispers about your unworthiness, the cruel letters questioning your bloodline, all of it built on the assumption that your mother's mysterious past reflected something shameful. If instead it reflects something rare and valuable, the entire narrative surrounding your place here shifts considerably. I do not want people to accept me, only because of some ancient bloodline, Elena said, a flash of her old stubbornness returning. I want to be judged on my own actions, not on rumors about blood I did not choose and know nothing about. That is a fair position, Damien said, though I suspect the Council and the wider pack will care a great deal about bloodline, regardless of your own feelings on the matter. People often find it easier to accept what they do not understand, once they have a familiar story to attach to it. Elena could not entirely disagree, though the idea unsettled her regardless. She spent the following days working alongside Ophelia during the healer's remaining visit, learning what fragments of Thornwood history the older woman could recall. Practicing small exercises meant to test whether any dormant gift might respond within her. Nothing dramatic occurred during those quiet sessions. No sudden burst of visible power, only a strange, warm awareness that settled beneath her skin whenever she focused her attention on a scraped knuckle or a bruised palm, something Ophelia insisted was a promising sign of gifts not yet fully awakened. Word of the healer's suspicions inevitably spread through the palace, as most things did, and Elena found the atmosphere around her shifting in ways both welcome and uncomfortable. Some of the cold stares softened into curious speculation. A few of the nobles who had previously ignored her now sought her out with newfound interest, eager to be associated with whatever significance her bloodline might carry. Elena found this sudden reversal almost more unsettling than the earlier hostility, uncomfortably aware that her worth in many eyes still depended on factors entirely outside her own choices and character. Seraphine Cole, predictably, refused to accept the healer's suspicions without challenge, spreading her own counter-narrative among her allies that suggested Ophelia Grant's observations were nothing more than an old woman's fanciful imagination, unsupported by any real proof. But even Seraphine's sharpest allies noted a subtle shift in the court's mood, a growing curiosity about the servant girl who might carry ancient, valuable blood, and Seraphine understood with mounting frustration that her path to reclaiming the crown had grown considerably more complicated. Damien, for his part, found himself increasingly troubled by a different concern entirely. If Elena's bloodline truly carried gifts significant enough to draw the attention of healers and scholars throughout the northern packs, it might also draw more dangerous attention from those who understood such gifts differently, who might see a rare and valuable bloodline as something to be captured, controlled, or eliminated, rather than protected and celebrated. He increased the guard around Elena's chamber, without telling her directly, quietly instructed Corin to remain especially vigilant, and began making careful inquiries about any recent movement near Blackthorn Ridge's borders that might suggest outside interest in the sudden revelations circulating through his court. He said nothing to Elena about these precautions, unwilling to add fresh worry to a woman already carrying more uncertainty than any person should reasonably bear. But the unease settled heavily in his chest regardless, a quiet dread that the peaceful, uneasy rhythm of their strange month together was approaching its end, far sooner than either of them was prepared for. Damien's caution proved justified sooner than he expected. The diplomatic summit had been planned for months before the disastrous selection, a gathering of northern pack leaders meant to discuss trade routes and border cooperation, and canceling it now would only raise further questions about the stability of Blackthorn Ridge. Damien insisted on proceeding as planned, though he tripled the guard presence throughout the palace grounds, and asked Elena to remain close to him, rather than wandering the gathered crowd alone. Seraphine Cole attended alongside her father, her expression carefully composed into polite diplomacy, though Elena caught the calculating glances she exchanged with several unfamiliar nobles throughout the evening, conversations conducted in low voices that ended abruptly whenever anyone else drew near. Elena mentioned her unease to Damien quietly during a lull in the evening's formal proceedings, but neither of them anticipated how quickly that unease would prove warranted. The attack came during the outdoor reception that followed the formal dinner, as guests mingled beneath lantern light strung between the garden trees. Elena had stepped away briefly to find Corin, who had reported unusual movement near the eastern wall, when the first shout of alarm broke through the pleasant murmur of the gathered crowd. Armed figures emerged from the tree line beyond the garden, moving with the coordinated speed of trained fighters rather than the chaotic aggression of common bandits. Guests screamed and scattered, guards rushed forward to intercept the intruders, and within moments, the peaceful gathering collapsed into panicked chaos. Elena froze, for only a heartbeat, before instinct took over, pulling her toward the fighting rather than away from it, searching desperately through the scattering crowd for any sign of Damien. She found him near the center of the chaos, engaged with two attackers at once, his movements sharp and controlled despite the danger, though she could see he was tiring against the coordinated assault. A third attacker circled behind him, weapon raised, positioned to strike, while Damien's attention remained fixed on the two fighters directly before him. Elena did not think. She simply moved, throwing herself between Damien and the striking blade without any clear plan, beyond preventing the blow from landing. Pain exploded through her side as the blade caught her, and she collapsed to the ground, distantly aware of Damien's furious shout, of the sudden shift in the fighting as he turned his full attention toward her attacker, with devastating speed. The world around her grew hazy and distant, sounds muffling as though heard through deep water, and she felt warmth spreading uncomfortably across her side, where her hand instinctively pressed against the wound. Something strange happened then, something Elena would struggle to fully explain even in the days that followed. A warmth, different from the spreading wetness of her injury, began building beneath her palm, gentle at first and then insistent, spreading outward from her hand into the wound itself. The sharp edges of the pain began to dull, not disappearing entirely, but softening into something manageable. And when Damien reached her moments later, kneeling beside her with visible panic on his face, he found the bleeding already slowing beneath her steady hand. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with fear as he examined the wound carefully, "stay with me. Help is coming." "I am here," she managed, though her voice came out weaker than she intended. "I do not think it is as bad as it looks." Ophelia Grant arrived within minutes, alerted by the chaos, and her experienced eyes widened with something between alarm and fascination as she examined Elena's wound, alongside the strange warmth still radiating faintly from her palm. "The bleeding has already slowed significantly," the healer said, working quickly to properly treat and bind the injury. "This should not be possible so soon after such a wound. Elena, can you tell me what you were doing when Damien arrived?" "I do not know," Elena admitted through gritted teeth as Ophelia worked. "I just pressed my hand against it. I was trying to slow the bleeding. I believe, Ophelia said slowly, exchanging a meaningful glance with Damien, that your gift has awakened, child, at precisely the moment your own life depended on it. The chaos of the attack took considerable time to fully resolve. Several guests suffered injuries, though thankfully none proved fatal, and the attackers, once subdued, revealed under questioning that they had been hired by an unfamiliar third party, with no clear connection to any of the gathered packs, their instructions vague, beyond causing significant disruption, and, if possible, targeting the king's newly bound mate specifically. The trail of who had actually arranged the attack proved frustratingly difficult to trace, though suspicion immediately fell toward those who stood to benefit most from Elena's removal. Seraphine Cole denied any involvement with visible outrage when questioned by the council, insisting she would never resort to violence regardless of her personal grievances, and no direct evidence linked her definitively to the attack. But Elena noticed, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion following her injury, that Seraphine's composure cracked slightly when questioned too closely about her earlier private conversations during the reception, a flicker of something that looked distinctly like guilt beneath her carefully maintained innocence. Damien remained by Elena's side throughout the remainder of that difficult night, refusing to leave, even after Ophelia finished treating her wound, and insisted she needed rest above all else. He sat beside her bed long after the palace finally settled into uneasy quiet, watching her sleep, with an expression Elena would only learn about later, described to her gently by Marta the following morning. "He looked at you," Marta said, settling a tray of tea beside Elena's bed once she finally woke. "The way a man looks at someone he cannot imagine losing. I have served this palace many years, child, and I have rarely seen our king look at anyone that way, not even in the earliest days of his courtship with Seraphine Cole." Elena absorbed this quietly, her mind still hazy from the previous night's events, her side aching despite the healer's careful treatment, and whatever strange gift had slowed her own bleeding in the chaos. She thought of Damien's furious shout as she fell, of his steady presence beside her bed throughout the long night, and felt something warm and frightening settle deeper into her chest, a certainty she had been trying to avoid acknowledging for weeks, finally becoming impossible to ignore. Whatever had begun as an unwanted mistake beneath the ancestor's moon had grown into something neither of them could dismiss any longer, tested now by real danger, and proven genuine by the instinct that had sent Elena throwing herself into harm's way, without a single moment's hesitation. The kingdom, too, began to see her differently in the days following the attack. Word spread quickly of how the servant girl chosen by accident had saved her king's life, had revealed a rare and valuable healing gift in the very moment her own survival depended on it, had proven through action, rather than words, that whatever fate or mistake had bound her to Damien, she was no burden unworthy of the crown. The whispers questioning her worthiness did not vanish entirely, but they grew quieter, overshadowed by a growing respect that Elena had never expected to earn and had certainly never sought. Only Seraphine Cole remained unmoved by the shifting tide of opinion, her fury simmering beneath careful composure, her resolve to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers, growing sharper rather than softer, with each passing day that Elena's position within the palace grew more secure. Elena's recovery took the better part of a week, during which Damien visited her chamber every single day, often staying long past what strict formality required. Their conversations during those quiet recovery days grew steadily more honest, stripped of the careful guardedness that had defined their earliest weeks together, replaced instead by an openness that surprised them both. "I keep thinking about that moment," Damien admitted one afternoon, seated in the chair beside her bed, while she worked slowly through a light meal Marta had prepared. "The moment you threw yourself in front of that blade. I have relived it more times than I can count, and each time, I imagine how differently it might have ended." "I did not think about it at all," Elena said honestly. "There was no calculation, no weighing of risk. I simply moved." "That frightens me more than it comforts me," Damien admitted. "You did not hesitate, even knowing the danger. What if next time the outcome is not so fortunate?" Elena set down her spoon, studying him carefully. "Would you have hesitated, in my place?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the question over honestly, rather than offering a convenient answer. "No," he admitted finally. "I do not suppose I would have." "Then perhaps you understand better than you realize. Elena said gently. Why I could not have done anything differently. He reached out then, taking her hand carefully in his own, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles, in a gesture that felt far more intimate than either of them had allowed themselves before. I have spent weeks telling myself that whatever grew between us during this month was simply the natural result of forced proximity, something that would fade once the council reached its decision and released us both from an accidental bond. I do not believe that any longer. Elena's heart beat faster, though she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, rather than looking away. What do you believe instead? I believe, Damien said slowly, that whatever force guided my voice that night, beneath the ancestors' moon, understood something about us that neither of us was ready to see for ourselves. I do not think it was purely accident, Elena. I think some part of me, buried beneath grief and exhaustion and duty, recognized something in you that my conscious mind had not yet allowed itself to notice. Elena sat with the weight of his words for a long moment, memories of that chaotic, humiliating night resurfacing with new significance. She thought of the flicker of doubt she had seen cross his face just before he spoke her name, the strange hesitation neither of them had been able to fully explain since. Perhaps Damien was right. Perhaps something older and wiser than either of their conscious minds had chosen correctly, even if neither of them had understood it at the time. I am not ready to fully trust this, Elena admitted honestly, though she did not pull her hand away from his. I have spent this entire month bracing myself for the council to end this bond, for you to eventually return to the life and the alliance you had originally planned. Trusting that this might be something real, something lasting, feels like setting myself up for a heartbreak I am not certain I can survive. I understand that hesitation, Damien said gently. I do not expect you to trust easily after everything this month has put you through. But I want you to know that whatever happens with the council's final decision, my feelings for you are no longer rooted in obligation or accident. They are entirely my own choice, freely made, regardless of what the ancient law originally intended. Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, by the careful patience with which he offered his feelings, without demanding anything in return. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I care to admit, she said softly. They did not rush toward any grand declaration that afternoon, both too aware of everything still unresolved around them, too cautious after weeks of danger and uncertainty, to leap too quickly into something neither fully understood yet. But something had shifted permanently between them, an acknowledgement finally spoken aloud that neither could take back, and the days that followed carried a new warmth between them that even the palace's watchful gossip could not fully diminish. News of the attempted attack and its aftermath eventually reached Alpha Cassian Cole, who arrived at the palace, demanding answers about his daughter's potential involvement, furious at the implications now circulating throughout northern pack circles. The confrontation between father and daughter, held privately within the council chambers, grew heated enough that raised voices carried faintly into the corridor beyond, though the exact details remained unknown to most of the palace staff. What emerged afterward was a Seraphine Cole, notably more subdued than before, her public composure still carefully maintained, but her earlier confidence visibly shaken. Whether her father had discovered genuine evidence of her involvement, or simply grown weary of the political damage her ongoing feud with Elena continued to cause the Cole family's reputation, Elena could not say for certain. But the whispered rumors that Seraphine's schemes might soon catch up with her fully began circulating with renewed intensity throughout the palace. Elena, focused on her own slow recovery and the strange, wonderful uncertainty of her growing feelings for Damien, found herself surprisingly unbothered by whatever consequences eventually caught up with Seraphine. She had spent weeks bracing against threats and cruelty from every direction, and the exhaustion of constant vigilance had begun to give way to something steadier, a growing confidence in her own place within the palace that no amount of scheming seemed able to fully undermine any longer. As the final days of the month-long joining period approached, Elena found herself facing an entirely different kind of uncertainty than the one that had greeted her the night of the selection. She no longer feared being unworthy of the position fate had thrust upon her. She no longer doubted her own strength or resilience in the face of a kingdom's judgment. What she feared now was far more personal, far more vulnerable than any political threat had managed to instill in her. She feared, quite simply, losing the man she had somehow, impossibly, fallen in love with, over the course of one chaotic, dangerous, transformative month. The final days before the council's decision arrived, with unexpected clarity, brought about not by careful investigation, but by Seraphine Cole's own unraveling composure. Confronted repeatedly by her father about the growing suspicion surrounding her, and increasingly desperate as her position within Northern Pack politics weakened with each passing week, Seraphine made a final, reckless attempt to secure the outcome she had originally planned for herself. She approached one of the palace guards privately, a young man newly assigned and eager to prove himself, offering considerable payment in exchange for testimony that would implicate Elena in some fabricated scheme against the crown, evidence carefully constructed to suggest Elena had manipulated the selection through forbidden means after all. The guard, troubled by the request rather than tempted by it, reported the entire conversation directly to Ferris and the council, rather than accepting the bribe. The revelation, when it finally came before the full council, confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. Seraphine's earlier involvement in spreading cruel rumors, her private conversations during the diplomatic summit shortly before the attack, and now this final desperate attempt to fabricate evidence against Elena, painted a clear and damning picture that even her father could no longer defend. Cassian Cole, humiliated and furious in equal measure, formally withdrew his family from any further political alliance discussions with Blackthorn Ridge, taking his daughter back to Redfern in disgrace, rather than allow her continued presence to further damage his own reputation among the Northern Packs. Seraphine left the palace in silence, her earlier fury replaced by something closer to defeat, understanding at last that her schemes had cost her everything she originally hoped to gain. Elena felt no particular satisfaction watching Seraphine's departure from a distance, only a quiet relief that the constant threat looming over her recovery and her growing relationship with Damien had finally been resolved. Whatever pain or resentment had driven Seraphine's actions, Elena understood too well the sting of watching an expected future slip away through circumstances beyond one's control, even if she could not condone the dangerous choices Seraphine had made in response. With the immediate political threat neutralized, the council turned its full attention toward the decision that had loomed over the entire month since that chaotic night beneath the ancestors' moon. Ferris called both Elena and Damien before the assembled elders on a bright morning that felt strangely calm after so many weeks of tension and danger. The joining period required by law has now concluded, Ferris announced formally, though his weathered face carried a warmth that suggested he already anticipated the outcome. It falls to this council to determine whether the bond declared that night was a genuine expression of fate, or whether it should be released as the accidental error it initially appeared to be. Elena stood beside Damien, her heart racing, despite the calm certainty that had grown steadily within her over the past weeks. She glanced sideways at him, finding his expression equally resolute, and felt a wave of quiet confidence settle over her earlier nerves. Before the council reaches its formal decision, Damien said, stepping forward with clear intention, I wish to speak plainly, without the careful diplomacy this chamber usually requires. Ferris nodded for him to continue, and the assembled elders leaned forward with visible curiosity. When I spoke Elena's name that night, Damien said, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the quiet chamber, I believed it was a mistake, born of grief and exhaustion. I spent the following weeks telling myself the same story, certain the council would soon correct an obvious error and allow life to return to its intended course. I no longer believe that story. I have watched this woman face cruelty and suspicion with more grace and courage than most nobles raised for exactly this kind of scrutiny. I have watched her throw herself into danger without hesitation to protect a child, and later, to protect me, discovering in that same terrible moment a gift that speaks to a heritage this pack should be honored to welcome, rather than question. Whatever force guided my voice that night, accident or fate, I no longer wish to see it undone. I choose Elena Marsh, not because ancient law bound us together by mistake, but because I have come to know her these past weeks, and find that I cannot imagine my future without her beside me. A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled elders, though Ferris's expression remained knowing, as though he had suspected this outcome for some time already. All eyes turned toward Elena, waiting for her own response to complete the formal proceeding. Elena took a steadying breath, aware of the weight of the moment, but no longer frightened by it the way she had been that first chaotic night. I came to this palace a month ago, as a servant girl thrust into a role I never asked for, and did not believe I deserved, she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. I spent weeks bracing myself for rejection, certain this strange accident would eventually be corrected, and I would return to the quiet, invisible life I had always known. But this month has taught me something I did not expect to learn. It has taught me that I do not need to hide myself to be safe, that my worth does not depend on bloodline, or title, or anyone else's approval. And it has taught me that the man standing beside me, who I once resented for the chaos his mistaken words brought into my life, has become someone I genuinely care for, not because law demands it, but because I have chosen to, freely and completely. The chamber fell silent for a long moment, before Ferris rose slowly from his seat, a genuine smile breaking across his weathered features. Then it is the decision of this council, he announced formally, that the bond declared beneath the ancestors' moon shall stand, confirmed not merely by ancient law, but by the genuine choice of both parties before this assembly. Elena Marsh, once servant of this palace, shall be formally recognized as intended Luna of Blackthorn Ridge, pending the traditional ceremony to complete the bond. A wave of relief and quiet joy washed over Elena, and she felt Damien's hand find hers, squeezing gently, as the assembled elders offered their formal approval of the council's decision. Whatever uncertainty had plagued the past month, whatever danger and cruelty had tested them both, they had emerged from it together, their bond proven genuine, not by accident alone, but by the deliberate choice each had made to embrace what fate had originally stumbled into creating. Word of the council's decision spread quickly throughout the palace and beyond, carried by grateful staff who had watched Elena's transformation, from frightened kitchen worker to confident, resilient near Luna, over the course of one extraordinary month. Marta wept openly with joy when she heard the news, embracing Elena warmly, despite the formality such displays usually required within palace walls. Corin grinned with obvious pride, relieved that his careful vigilance throughout the month had helped protect someone who had become far more than simply an assignment to guard. Yet even as celebrations spread through the palace, Damien requested one final consideration from the council before the formal ceremony proceeded, a request that surprised even Elena when she first heard it. I understand the council has confirmed the bond according to law, Damien said, addressing the assembled elders once the initial celebration had settled, and I am deeply grateful for that confirmation, but I find myself wanting something more than legal recognition alone. That night beneath the ancestors' moon, Elena's name left my mouth by accident, shaped by grief and exhaustion rather than clear intention. I would like the opportunity to speak her name again, deliberately and completely, before the full pack, so that no shadow of accident remains attached to the beginning of our bond. Ferris considered this request thoughtfully, before nodding his agreement. A second selection has not been formally requested within living memory, he said, though nothing in our law forbids it. If you wish to stand before the pack once more and choose deliberately what fate first offered by chance, the council sees no reason to deny such a request. Elena, standing beside him, felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, understanding immediately why this mattered so much to him. He wanted her to know, beyond any lingering doubt, that whatever confusion had marked their beginning, his choice now was entirely his own, freely made and fully conscious. You do not have to do this for my sake, she told him quietly, once they had stepped away from the council chamber. I already believe you, Damien. I do not need a second ceremony to prove what you have already shown me these past weeks. I know I do not have to, Damien said, taking her hands gently in his own. I want to. I want the entire kingdom to witness a choice made with clear eyes and a steady heart, not a mistake corrected by law alone. I want your name spoken beneath that same moon, deliberately this time, so that our story is remembered not as an accident that fate happened to bless, but as a choice two people made together, fully and completely. Elena could not argue against such sincerity, nor did she particularly want to. She found herself looking forward to the ceremony, with a lightness she had not expected to feel, given how disastrous her first experience beneath the ancestors' moon had been. The weeks leading up to the second selection passed more gently than the tumultuous month before it. Elena spent time preparing alongside Marta, who insisted on teaching her the finer points of palace customs she would need as Luna, though she balanced these lessons with regular visits to her old friends in the kitchens, refusing to let her new position separate her entirely from the people who had shaped her early life. She continued working with Ophelia Grant during the healer's extended stay, slowly learning to understand and control the gift that had awakened within her during the attack, discovering with quiet wonder the full extent of what her mother's hidden heritage had passed down to her. Damien, meanwhile, worked diligently to repair whatever lingering political damage remained from Seraphine's schemes and the broken alliance with the Cole family, reaching out instead to strengthen relationships with other northern packs who had grown genuinely curious and respectful toward the story of Blackthorn Ridge's remarkable Near Luna. The kingdom, having watched Elena's journey unfold over the course of one dramatic month, seemed largely eager to embrace the second selection as a joyful celebration, rather than a mere formality. On the evening of the ceremony, the Great Hall filled once more with pack members from Blackthorn Ridge and beyond, though the atmosphere carried none of the tense uncertainty that had marked the original selection. Elena stood near the back of the hall as tradition required, though this time she wore garments befitting her new position rather than a servant's plain gray dress, and the eyes that turned toward her carried warmth and anticipation rather than confused judgment. Damien stood upon the platform, composed and steady, none of the grief and exhaustion that had clouded his mind during the first ceremony weighing on him now. He looked out across the gathered crowd, found Elena's eyes waiting for his own, and felt a calm certainty settle over him that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with genuine, freely chosen love. 1 month ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, I stood in this same place and spoke a name I did not intend to speak. Many of you witnessed the confusion and uncertainty that followed, the questions about whether fate or accident had shaped that moment. Tonight, I stand before you with no confusion remaining, no uncertainty clouding my heart or my mind. I have spent this past month coming to know a woman of remarkable courage, honesty, and strength, someone who faced cruelty and danger with more grace than I believed possible, someone whose presence in my life has become something I choose deliberately, not something ancient law simply assigned to me by chance. He paused, his gaze finding Elena's once more across the crowded hall, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of conscious, certain choice. Elena Marsh, he called, deliberately and clearly, each word chosen with complete intention. I ask you to step forward and accept your place as my chosen Luna, not by accident, but by my own free and certain heart. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes as she moved forward through the parting crowd, her steps far steadier than they had been that first chaotic night, carrying none of the fear and confusion that had marked her earlier journey toward the platform. She reached Damien and took his offered hand, turning to face the assembled pack together with him, the two of them standing united in a moment that finally, completely belonged to both of them by choice rather than chance. I accept, she said, her voice ringing clear and strong through the hall, not the mistake that first brought us together, but the man who chose me deliberately, who defended me when the kingdom doubted me, who stood beside me through danger and uncertainty until we found our way to this moment together. I choose you as well, Damien Voss, freely and completely, with a heart no longer bound by accident but by genuine, certain love. The hall erupted into celebration, cheers and warm applause replacing the stunned silence that had greeted their first chaotic pairing. Marta wept happy tears near the front of the crowd. Corin grinned with quiet pride from his post near the platform. Even old Ferris, usually so composed and formal, allowed himself a broad, satisfied smile as he watched the completion of a bond he had helped guide through its most difficult early days. Outside the palace walls, beneath the same pale, watchful moon that had witnessed the beginning of their strange and unexpected story, the forest remained quiet and still, indifferent as always to the chaos and change unfolding within the kingdom below. But within the great hall of Blackthorn Ridge, Elena Marsh, once an invisible servant girl who had spent her life avoiding notice, stood proudly beside her king, transformed not by fate alone, but by her own courage, resilience, and the deliberate, freely chosen love that had grown from one accidental mistake into something neither of them would ever wish to undo. The wrong name had been spoken that first night beneath the ancestors' moon, but standing together now, hand in hand before their entire kingdom, both Elena and Damien understood with complete certainty that no mistake, however it had begun, could have led them anywhere other than exactly where they were always meant to be.